Welcome to the Regenaissance Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Griggs. Visit www.theregenaissance.co to learn more. It's a long time coming, but I think this is actually a great timing to start. Just from the things that we mentioned before starting this, especially with the farm suicide rates, which we can talk about later. But before that, I would just love to hear about the impetus to starting Amber Oaks Ranch. And did you grow up on a farm, or is this okay?
I didn't.
Yeah, then I would love to hear the backstory to this.
Yeah. So, I guess to make a long story short, we were living in an HOA outside of Dallas, and it was really, it's not the way I grew up. So I had six brothers and sisters, and so it was pretty normal for us to just run around, right? And there in Frisco, the kids couldn't just run around. It seemed like everything was very programmed, and so all of the other parents were coordinating play dates, taking their kids to ballet, taking their kids to, baseball, soccer, that type of stuff. They were hiring special coaches, all of these different things that I didn't think was a good way for kids to grow up. I thought it was important that they kind of experience life on their own, figure things out on their own, as opposed to everything being controlled for them. So my in-laws were living south of Houston at the time, and we went and visited them. They had 3 acres out there, and it was a totally different environment, right? The kids there were running around on four-wheelers. They were, playing in the mud. There was no, supervision, if you will. They were just out being kids. And I'm like, this is normal. This is the way kids should grow up. So we ended up moving down to just outside of Texas City, halfway between Houston and Galveston, and we bought 7 acres there. And I kind of, I'd always kind of been more of a preparedness kind of guy, and so we started raising our own food. We had chickens, and ultimately we added pigs and sheep, and we just kind of had a little homestead there, and started. Once you get the animals, then you start figuring out, well, okay, I got to butcher these animals. We love to eat lamb, and so we started butchering animals, and really that's kind of the beginning of it all. Is kind of going from a homestead to what I consider now a farmstead.
So whenever you first started the homestead, how much research and preparation were you doing for all of that before, I guess, really just diving in?
Yeah, I mean, I read a lot of books. What is the I think it's Story. Anyway, there's this bunch of series of books about raising livestock and stuff like that. I Backwoods Home Magazine was a big learner for me, and I was also listening to the Survival Podcast, which was that's getting really annoying. My phone is beeping. Kill that. So listening to Jack Spirko on the Survival Podcast, just as good ideas on homesteading and preparedness and that type of stuff. So I didn't really. I don't think there was a whole lot on the internet at that time. Maybe there was. This was 2006. So from that perspective, it was a couple podcasts here and here, a bunch of books, a couple magazines, and just getting out and doing it. Right. I'm more of a learner. I'll take a concept, but I want to make it my own. So I'll go and, just do it and figure it out. And I think that's important because there's a whole bunch of information out there about how people do things, but you really need to tailor it to your own needs and situations. So I think that's important. And I tried a bunch of things that just didn't work,
Well, I guess, could you elaborate on that?
On what didn't work?
Yeah.
Yeah. Gosh, what didn't work?
Because I just think what's really interesting, especially since I switched in agriculture and actually worked on a farm, and seeing how social media views living life on the land can very easily be sensationalized.
Yeah.
And then they actually do the work and realize, oh, there's a lot that goes into that, and there's a lot that goes wrong. And
I'm a big proponent of starting small.
Yeah.
I think, I think it's kind of foolish to at least not apprentice somewhere just to get a taste of how things are.
I agree with that.
I think you can do a lot on 1 acre. 3 acres is plenty to homestead on. 7 acres for me was a lot of work. Some of the thing going back to your earlier question, some of the things that I got wrong. We started with rabbits, right? So when we first moved there, I thought, let's get the kids, integrated into the community. So we started with 4-H, and uh, we, I didn't, the easiest thing to get into is rabbits, I thought, and uh, not to diss 4-H. I think there's a lot of upsides, but we went to a meeting or two, and I just didn't think that was the right education for the kids. It was really about winning a prize, not about how to raise animals
Mhm.
for sustainably from a long-term perspective, that type of stuff. It's pour the most expensive feed that you can into the most expensive breeding stock that you
Mhm.
can buy, and hope that you come out with a $20,000 scholarship, right? But so early on we was like, okay, let's get rabbits, let's do the 4-H thing. The problem with rabbits in South Texas is it's freaking hot, and male rabbits will go infertile if it's too hot, right?
Mhm.
Their genitals have to be cool, right, for the sperm to stay alive, and that
Mhm.
just doesn't happen in 100-degree, 98-degree sweltering heat of the Texas Gulf Coast. So that was my first lesson in things that that weren't didn't go well, and then from that, the kids were like, I butchered the rabbits. The kids, have an association with this cuddly rabbit, right? And so they didn't really want to eat it. So I had all of this rabbit,
Hmm.
that they didn't really want to eat. So that just stuff like that along the way. I experimented in a bunch of permaculture concepts, many of which are uh, beneficial and well, I'm sure they're all beneficial, but again, situation dependent, right? A lot of them didn't fit my situation, so learned a lot. Loved putzing around doing it, so it was all good. Nothing. It's always a good learning experience. Even it's especially a good learning experience whenever it doesn't work.
Hmm. No, I agree with that, and a lot of stuff won't work, and that was another thing that I learned was just watching the farm owner, his quick thinking with everything, but that's just because 'cause he's been working on a farm
Mhm.
pretty much his whole life.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, you realize how quickly they are a veterinarian, a mechanic, a plumber, a
hmm,
carpenter, everything, and
yeah, yeah.
it's
Yeah,
so
and I
impressive.
like it for
Yeah.
that reason, right? And then when you get to doing it direct to consumer, now you're a small business owner on top of that, right? So that's what I really enjoy about it. It's never dull, lots of diversity. Like you said, one minute you're an engineer and a heavy equipment operator, and the next minute you're castrating cows or whatever, right? So yeah, it's a pretty broad spectrum occupation, or for me, kind of a quasi hobby. So
Hmm. So you started it out as a homestead, and then was there one point to where you wanted to just expand and turn that into a farmstead, or yeah, what was that thinking as that was going on?
yeah, so I'd been reading a lot more. Joel Salatin has a bunch of books out on making money off of your homestead. I'd been reading those. Also, just getting feedback from the people who were eating our meat. So, we were really growing it for us. Our family was close by. We also had a couple friends from church that would get some. I'd also done a couple of classes for homeschool kids in and around, right? And that's really what I thought I was going to focus on is education from a homesteading perspective, right? Teaching kids how to, can food, how to butcher animals, you know, uh, s- you know, uh, basic rifle marksmanship, stuff like that. Um, but when we got there, so we bought 70 acres outside of Taylor, Texas, um, and we had to start from nothing, right? It was just an empty piece of property with perimeter fencing. So initially, we ended up building our house and then putting in well, actually, I started putting in some infrastructure for cattle because it was such a large piece of land. And so taking that feedback that I'd gotten earlier about the quality of meat, doing a little bit of research around, the potential for having a little side gig. And again, from a preparedness perspective, I still have a full-time off-farm job. But from a preparedness perspective, it's wise to have a second source of revenue, right? To have a side gig.
Mhm.
So I thought this was going to be my side gig, and it is my side gig. But And so putting all of that together, it's like, yeah, let's take this to the next level. Let's start producing and selling direct to consumer. And Austin's a great place to do that, right? There's a market for it. So yeah, all of those things kind of came together and worked in my favor.
So with having a full-time job, how are you able to manage all of that?
Yeah. So fortunately, I work from home, um, and it's a pretty flexible work arrangement. And so initially, it was it's a whole bunch of work. And so at the time, I was even when we built our house, I was working pretty much 6 a.m. to about 3 p.m. And then we were staying with my in-laws, which is 20 minutes away from our property. We would drive out there in the afternoon, or after 3, work until sundown around 7 or 8 o'clock at night, and we did that for 6 months to build the house, and all of the other projects, etc. So when I was developing the property and putting in the infrastructure, it's important to do that with kind of like a systems approach, right? How do I make things simple on myself, so where I'm not like carrying water out to the animals or what have you? And so I built infrastructure that really supported the ability to, a minimum amount of inputs, if you will. So right now I spend about 30 minutes in the morning and 30 minutes in the evening taking care of the animals, and that's about all it takes. And then on the weekends, I work probably, you know, 16 hours, I guess, maybe 20 hours. Um, and that's when I take care of the bulk of everything I have to do. Sometimes it's a little bit more. And there's times during the week where like I'm taking chickens to the butcher or whatever, and that takes, obviously more time,
Mhm.
that type of stuff. But I'm able to work it out. Yeah. And then Molly, my wife, she does the farmers markets primarily. So
So I guess that would be a good segue to talk about farmers markets. I'm just curious because there's a lot of pros to it, but then there's also a lot of cons. So I would just love to have your perspective on how you view farmers markets from your perspective.
yeah, I guess to start with, like what's the alternative, right? And so if I wanted to sell my meat, I guess the alternative is to use some distributor that I sell to them and then they sell to the customer, right? And there's a lot of guys that do that. And that's a great service, right? Particularly if you live in a remote area and you don't have a market to sell to. Going to the commodity sector and selling your livestock at the auction is in my opinion foolish, right? You're a price taker at that point. Um, and you're subject to all of this other stuff, and there's no value for the quality that you put into your animals, right? And so what is the alternative? I don't know. Um, but with respect to the farmers markets, it takes a long time to get established and be a player, if you will. So you're pouring a whole lot of energy into it, and you're learning a lot as you go. Um, Today it's raining outside. You're going to have shitty days at the market, but sometimes you're going to have days you just knock it out of the park. And I haven't figured out like what controls those variables. I've been doing this for probably 5 years now, and really just can't figure out what makes a good market one day and not the next week.
Yeah.
Um, but again, I have a kind of a love hate relationship with the market. I love having interactions with the customers. It's it's a joy to hear from people talk about how much they value my product, right? And it's also I like educating new customers on, what's the difference between what we have and what you can find at the grocery store. Um, I like, talking about what we do. People seem to appreciate what we do at the farmers market, whereas in the grocery store, people don't even know
Yep.
what goes into that, right? There's no touch point with their farmers. Um, and so I like that aspect of it, right? And I like, the kids come out. I over 5 years, when you see a kid in a stroller, one year and the next year they're a toddler, and then by that time they're riding their bike around. I just like to see all of that because I don't know. I feel like people invite me into their home by putting my product on their dinner table. They're, you know, going out of their way. It's not an easy thing to go to a farmer's market, right? They're going out of their way. They're spending a premium on my product, and that makes me feel good. So,
You brought up so many great points. The first one being what's the alternative? Because I think about that a lot. When I worked on the farm, did farmers markets Thursday through Sunday. I eventually essentially became the farmers market guy to where I was doing all four of them, and this was in Southwest Pennsylvania. So they did one in West Virginia, two in Maryland, and one in Pennsylvania. And I just remember the one in Pennsylvania was every Saturday. I would have to wake up at 4:45 in the morning. We already had everything packed the night before just because that would just be a mess trying to
Yeah.
pack everything that early. Drive an hour, set up an hour, and then just get started right at 8. And it's very love-hate, definitely
Yeah.
how I, experienced it too, because it was amazing hearing the customers. Even though I'd only been on this farm for a couple months, I wasn't there, say, whenever they first got the animals and all of that. I didn't go through the whole entire process, but I was still at part of that and harvested and then took it to the farmer's market, and just hearing their stories
Yeah.
was really awesome. So I can only imagine actually being the farmer behind all of that and then hearing how much they value the food. It really is awesome. And then also in terms of the education too, because I remember there'd be folks wondering why our corn was priced higher than the neighbors. That's because the neighbors did it conventionally
Mhm.
and used all kinds of chemical sprays. So we have to try to educate on that. But then there's also, again, there are so many downsides with the
Yeah.
weather dependent. There were so many times where it poured down rain the whole time. You barely got any
Yeah.
customers.
It's very demoralizing.
It is, because then you're driving an hour back soaked.
Yeah.
Your clothes are soaked, the food's all soaked, and you didn't sell much.
Yeah.
So then you have to go back to the farm and talk about how little you sold. I remember there was one time to where one of the premium products they had was really awesome ginger that they grew in the greenhouse. That was their premium product, but also sold very well. There was a couple times that we forgot to pack that.
Mm.
And so you make that one small mistake,
Yeah.
then there goes a huge portion of the profits that day. But again, going back to what's the alternative?
Yeah.
It's
I mean, you could like nowadays you could do it all online, right?
yeah,
I don't ship my product. I mean, that's just a whole nother business unit, if you will. For us, it's not practical because my source for dry ice would be here in Austin. We're about an hour away, and then there's a lot of this is people do it and they're successful at it, but there's a lot of risk involved, um, and so and quite honestly, we probably don't have enough product to venture out into that to make it worthwhile. I've toyed with this idea several times, but I always keep coming back to it's just not going to work for my situation. Again, a lot of people make this work, and more power to them. I also think too, I don't really want to. I want the people that live in Dallas to find a farmer in Dallas, right? I want the people that live in Temple to find a farmer in Temple. So from that perspective, I know there's convenience for the consumer, and I understand too that you know maybe there's not a market for them, but for me, I think I'm quite happy with serving the community that we're in, and we only do one market in Austin, and that's just recently. So we pretty much focus on the East Austin area, Elgin, Pflugerville, and Taylor. And those markets are not as profitable as being in Austin, but I know my customers and they know me, and it's just where we started, and I really appreciate how they've helped me get where I am. So though I've thought many a times, look, this market I could go do another market in Austin. We just keep coming back because I just have, in my opinion, egocentric as it is, I have people that rely on me,
mhm.
right? And so I want to make sure I'm there for them.
That's why. I mean, that's one of the biggest reasons why I have Regenaissance and the podcast, because I completely agree with the sentiment of buying locally. I mean, that's why I'm consistently preaching online to shake your rancher's hand.
Hmm.
There's all kinds of maps. You can just do a simple Google search.
Yeah.
Because I also agree in the sense of the alternative, it would just be buying directly from the farmer or ranch. Um, but having those relationships, it's why I continue to push that. Is we've been so disconnected for so long
Yeah.
to where most folks not only have never had a relationship with they don't have a current relationship with a farmer rancher. They never have. They've never talked to them. Never have visited a rancher farm. And I think that's such a critical component to why we have so many health issues is we've just have this massive disconnection to where now folks even believe that grocery store, that's where the food comes from, not from the farm and ranch. And
Yeah.
that just boggles my mind. That's where we're at in today's society. Um,
And from a preparedness standpoint, again, I'm always thinking about, what could go wrong, and people are coming to this realization finally. With me, it started kind of with, well, a little bit with 9/11. We were living outside of New York at the time, but Hurricane Katrina really opened my eyes to just like how broken everything could become very quickly. And then we went through Hurricane Ike in South Texas, but then just recently with COVID, right? It's like people are lined up at the grocery store. People were, fighting over toilet paper.
yep.
And so, I try to, I, it's important to build community, right? And from my perspective as an individual trying to practice self-reliance, and then for the consumer's perspective too, it's like, hey, if you don't know where, your food comes from, if you're not able to go to that rancher whenever the shit hits the fan and say, hey, I need some meat. My kids are hungry. They're not going to know you when that time comes, right? If you don't make relationships with them beforehand. So I think it's important from that perspective that we build community amongst ourselves, like-minded folks, amongst farmers as well. It's not really a competition. There's plenty of market space for all of us. So several of my neighbors and good friends are all doing the same thing we're doing.
Hmm.
We help each other get by. So yeah, it's a very good community, and I think it's very important that people, you know, figure this out before it's too late, right? Before the systems all fall apart again. So
It's very fragile.
yeah.
On the topic of self-sufficiency and homesteading, because that has really picked up a lot of steam the last couple years,
Mhm.
especially on I'd noticed all the time on Instagram with homesteading. Uh, for anyone listening that might be having that in the back of their head that that's something they might want to do, what would some advice you'd have to give in terms of because you were saying they would only need a couple acres.
Mhm.
Um,
You don't even need that really. I mean,
yeah, I
there's
guess what would you recommend for them to just really get their feet wet if they
yeah,
want to think about self-sufficiency and homesteading?
start where you're at, right? Um, you know, don't think that this is something for other people or someday I'll have 100 acres, right? Start where you're at. And I think when I say that, if you're living in an apartment, get a couple tomato plants and put it on your balcony, right? If you have a garage, you can start raising meat, right? You can get quail and you can raise quail in your garage. They're very prolific birds. You can get eggs and meat from quail. You can do this all like probably in a 4x4 by 4 vertical um, area that you can probably put you know 15 to 20 quail in that amount of space, right? Is it regenerative? No. Does it provide you some self-sufficiency and some redundancy in your life? Absolutely. And maybe you don't need that many, but cut your teeth on something small like that. You can do rabbits in your garage as well. Um, and then there's lots of ways to, you can grow mushrooms, you can grow vegetables on a small scale. All of these things you can do right where you're at right now. And it's a great way to start learning, right? And so that when you do end up with your, 3 to 5 acres or what have you, you've already, got a little bit of experience under your belt. You've worked through some of these ideas. Now you just need to scale them up, right?
Whenever you were looking for land, what made you decide on where you're at currently?
So I grew up in Georgetown, and Taylor is about, I don't know, 40 minutes away, 30 minutes away. And my wife's parents live in Taylor, and her brother. And so we kind of wanted to come back to Central Texas. Well, we were living south of Houston, off the coast of Galveston, about 20 minutes from the coast. It's not a very pleasant place to live.
No.
It's so hot,
Yep.
so humid. Mosquitoes are outrageous. It rains all the time. So when the kids graduated high school, we knew we wanted to get out of there. And so again, with where our family was located, we kind of figured, and they're getting up there in age. We figured we'd come back to Central Texas for that main reason. And then we went looking for land in and around Taylor, and it's really kind of boring. It's the Blackland Prairie of Texas, right? So it's very fertile ground, but most of it's just open fields, primarily corn and cotton. But if you head east a little bit towards College Station, you kind of get into what's called the Post Oak Savanna region of Texas. Very pretty, not very fertile though. Our soil is, well, if you even call it soil, it's pretty much sand.
Hmm.
And so it is a challenge from that perspective. But we fell in love with the piece of property. It was outside of my price range. I was only really looking for about 30 acres, and it's a weird dynamic, especially at the time. Uh, I could get 70 acres for about 25% more than I could get 30 acres. And that was really weird to me.
Yeah.
But I think the thing was, like 10 acres was very expensive. 20 acres, it kind of plateaued around 20. 30 started to taper off, but then it really dropped off after 30. And I think at the time, this was in 2016, the people from Austin and Round Rock, they were looking to get out of, have a place to go on the weekends, right? Or a place to hunt, et cetera. And 70 acres is just a lot of work, right? But they could get the same thing in 20 acres, right? They could go have a pond, they could go hunt, and so the 20-acre lots, 30-acre lots were going at a premium, if you will. And so when we saw that place, it was beautiful. It had lots of water, has lots of water on it. And so we just kept coming back to that. It's like, oh wow, I don't know how we can make this work. And my wife convinced me that we'll figure it out later. And so that's also is one of the reasons of why we got this side gig, right, is to help make the land pay for itself. But yeah, that's how we ended up back in Central Texas, and why we chose that piece.
Can you explain what you mean by have the land pay for itself?
Again, it's kind of like turning your hobby into a money making stream, right? And in making your assets work for you. So most people, if you look around, they have a $300,000 to $500,000 house that's 3,000 square foot. It's not making them any money, right? And they're pouring a lot of money into it. They have a swimming pool. They're pouring a lot of money into that. They have very expensive cars. They're paying every month they're paying $600 to pay off the loan. In my mind, that's not wise. For me, I would rather have my assets working for me. So we invested a lot of money in cattle. I probably initially put in about $50,000 into the cows, put a whole bunch of money into the infrastructure. But in the long run, I think that'll ultimately, pay for itself and then pay dividends in return. So we're kind of at that point where it's been 5 years now. No, it's probably been 7 years since we started with the infrastructure. We're getting to that point now where I think that we're starting to turn a corner, and it's starting to pay for itself. But, again, it's a very capital intensive business to get into.
I think this is a great segue into your newsletter with Joel Salatin, talking about the statistics behind farmer versus soldier suicide rates, which I found astounding when you mentioned that. So if you can
Yeah.
just mention
I
that.
was astounded too. The Stockman grass farmer, Joel writes I think he calls it Meadow Notes or something like that. Basically, it's the editor's notes. And so usually I put this it's a hardcover, or not it's a newspaper basically. It's a periodical once a month. Usually I just set it aside until I have time to read it front to back. Excuse me. Um, but they're right on the cover. It immediately started talking about suicide, and comparing the suicide rate for farmers to to veterans. And I'm acutely aware of the issue that we have with our veterans. It pains me to think about the number of veterans that just veterans in general, and their state of well-being, and the number of people that are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of our wars in other countries. And I can go on and on about that, but I'll save you my rant. And so when Joel referenced the suicide rate for farmers relative to veterans, I was astonished. And the numbers are, if I get this right, it's 36 farmers commit suicide. 36 out of 100,000 farmers commit suicide every year, whereas veterans, I think it's like 27 out of 100,000. Of course, there's a lot more veterans than there are farmers. Um, but to me, that's like 30% more suicide rate per capita. I was like, wow, that's horrendous. That's horrible. And then I started thinking about how many of those veterans were actually farmers, right? Because the military purposefully recruits, kids off the farm. To your point earlier, they can do everything, right? They're very industrious people, and so they make really good soldiers. When I was a soldier, the best soldiers were farmers, right? Um, and so, I don't know what the overlap is there, but I started thinking about that, and it's like, why? Why are farmers committing suicide? And I just couldn't piece it together, really, because my reality is different from their reality. My reality is I get immediate feedback from my customers. It's not, I'm not in debt to big ag, all of those things. And so when you start thinking about what does our, commonplace farmer endure, it's, you know, I, I, I I can't put myself in their shoes, but I can understand the pressure that they're under. When you look at, here in Texas, we've had 2 years successive of really hard droughts. It's been very hard.
I mean, there's the largest wildfire in Texas
Yeah, yeah,
history
that
that
too.
just decimated the cattle and out in West
Yeah,
Texas.
yeah, and so in the markets, COVID was a challenge for them. All of these things stacking up, they're in debt way beyond their means because really it's go big or go home kind of mentality. And so you have this equipment that's hundreds of thousands of dollars to be just a player, and how do you make that asset pay for itself whenever you're a price taker? So and you look at the amount of food dollars that the farmer actually gets. I think it's like 14.5 cents for every dollar that the consumer spends goes to the farmer. It's like, wow. I mean, I don't know how they make any money. I'm not really making any money. Last year I figured it out. I'm making $15.75 an hour.
What's so not funny, but the irony in that is I see so much critique to agriculture and farmers and ranchers thinking that they're in it for the money.
Yeah,
And that is the most outrageous claim out of
yeah,
everything you could possibly say,
yeah.
that they're in for the money, because that just shows full blown ignorance on their part.
I think they go into it with good intentions, right? And a lot of them, come from that background, and a lot of them are out in the middle of nowhere, and there's not a whole lot of opportunity for them. Of course, that's changing with the prevalence of the internet and things like that. But most of these people are working multiple jobs, also, right? And they, their father or grandfather, a lot of those guys still own the land, and then the kids end up working for them. The article that Joel actually he went on to talk about succession planning and how that creates a lot of conflict in the family. But these guys, they go into it with the right. They love nature. They love the animals. They love working by themselves. They're very independent lot. And I think that independence creates a little bit of psychological challenges, right? They don't have anybody to really talk to about their problems. Nobody really understands their problems. But I think the biggest thing is they're just a cog in the machine, right? There is no feedback loop whatsoever. Where, like for me, I get to talk to my customers at the farmers market. They get to tell me about all of the healing that's going on in their lives as a result of my food. For them, it just gets on a truck and it goes away, and I could see that would be soul crushing.
Well, have you heard or read the book Meat Racket?
I have not.
I haven't finished it, but it talks about the history of Tyson and how they're essentially just modern day feudal lords,
Yes, they
to
are.
where the farms that agree to be like host the chickens and do all of that, they have no say in anything. And Tyson has all the power, and they continue to just screw over the farms year after year after year, and they can place all of the blame on these farmers too. So it's just an insane amount of pressure. You have essentially no power. You're literally powerless, and you're a cog in the machine. That's how they view
Yeah.
it all. I
Yeah,
mean,
I had a guy I worked with, his son was one of those chicken farmers. And I think he's out by El Paso. And yeah, so basically they hand you a recipe says you build your all of your equipment like this. You put in all of this infrastructure just like this. We will sell you the chicks, we will sell you the feed, and we will buy your chickens. And then once you get in there, the screws start to tighten, right? And you realize that this sucks, but you've just invested all of this money. And now what do? Now you have all of this debt on top of you. How do you get out from underneath of that? It truly is indentured servitude.
They talked about, I think his name's Jerry Yandel, but how the chickens in one specific house kept getting sick, and so they made him spend more money to try to improve the houses. They still got sick. They ended up having to butcher a lot, so they didn't even sell a lot of those chickens. So
Mhm.
that takes away more money from him. And then I don't want to. I need to go back, but I'm fairly certain too. Tyson was well aware that they were sending them sick chicks too. So
Oh,
just there's just so many variables like
yeah,
that that you don't even think about to where the farmer doesn't even realize that they're just getting completely screwed over
yeah.
in every part of the process. And yeah, it's just
Yeah, I mean, it
ridiculous.
it gets to a point where, like, my only option out, you know?
Yeah.
And that's a hard place to be. Fortunately, I've never been in that position, but I commiserate with those guys. It's a heck of a thing. And so when you put that into perspective, like, what does that mean for the future of our country? If the suicide rate is so high, if they're basically slaves to the system, um, when people come along and there's an opportunity to sell the land and get off the farm, you can't blame them for taking it,
Yeah.
right? But what does that mean for our natural resource of food production, right? How dependent upon, you know, foreign national, coming in and buying up that land, um, importing food from China and Brazil and wherever, or and you have all of the pressure from a societal problem around them being pollutants, right? You're just a polluter, right? And we're going to tax you as a result of that. All of that is super demoralizing. Why would you do this? And then, their answer to all of this is get off the land and we'll just grow meat in a lab, you know, that type of stuff.
Yeah.
And so as a country, do we want that to happen? I don't want that to happen.
I don't
You know,
either.
I don't know that people even give this a thought though, right? This is just and I don't blame them. They've got kids and jobs and things like that. But I just wish more people would think about what this means to, civilization and certainly society. But our civilization as we know it, it could easily change. It's changed before. And so you got these people who are trying their best. How can we help them be successful? And so we started out talking about, getting to know your farmer. I think that if more people just took the time to reach out to their farmer and say, hey, I see you're raising cattle, you know, you ever thought about selling a half a cow? I'll buy a half a cow. If I need to buy the whole cow, I'll find some friends and we'll buy the whole cow. Same thing with pigs and all of that other stuff. I just think if more people did that, it would awaken the farmer's eyes to the possibility that there's a market. They don't have to be price takers, right? They can create their own market and they can find people who value what they do because certainly big ag doesn't value what they do.
Not at all. But that's why I push as much as possible, as much education as possible, because I truly believe the only way this will ever change is by how you vote with your dollar.
Yeah,
That's the
absolutely.
only way this will change.
Absolutely.
And so if people are still going to the stores and buying, uh, if they just solely rely on just grocery store and they're not buying any local produce or meat or anything from farms or ranches, I don't.
And they may think they're buying local,
Yeah,
up until 2026, which is actually when the law goes into effect.
yeah,
But the product of the USA labeling was completely fraudulent, right? And so they may be looking at a package of pork chops, and it says product of the USA, and they think, well, at least I'm buying local. But chances are that pig comes from a different country, gets butchered in a different country, put on a ship, brought to the U.S., and then parted out and packaged in the U.S. And they were able to call that product of the USA. So it's not
Yeah.
like our government is helping us out.
No, labeling is all over the place. You
Yeah,
could have, I mean, Hellman's mayo, they call it real mayo, and you look at the ingredients, it's got soybean oil, it's got all kinds of emulsifiers.
yeah.
You have Kraft cheese that only needs to be 51% of actual
That's not even
cheese.
cheese.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's plastic.
And so there's all kinds of things like that. And then the same institutions, you look at the dietary guidelines for 2020 to 2025, they're telling you to stop consuming butter and use vegetable oils instead. So how can you,
Yeah,
again, that's why I have this. There's so much
there
misinformation.
really is.
We're being misled on so much. And then talking about the go big or go home with agriculture, that continues to be pushed
Yeah,
with big dairy. Dairies are closing at an astronomical rate, which again is why I'm pushing for raw milk, because here is a superfood that we should have the right to choose between pasteurized and raw. But I think the more people that realize that we should have this and then also vote with the dollars, that could also really help transform. And then any interested folks that might want to start their own micro dairy, well, there's a market now for
yeah.
that. And
And we created a market. So some friends of ours, they have a couple of dairy cows. I think they have three. And so we're selling their milk at the farmer's market
hmm,
just so that I could provide another product for my customers, which, they want it, so I'll provide it. But also to encourage some of these smaller dairies to, make some money off of what you're doing, right? They had one cow, they were raising, for themselves, for their own milk. It's like, hey, I could offload your surplus, and then from there it kind of grew. They got two more cows. So yeah, I think it's we can partner together and we can solve this problem. But like you said, it starts with the consumer voting with their dollars, right?
yeah.
One and again, like I said earlier, I know it's not easy. I fully appreciate that this is a premium product and that you have to go out of your way to get it. And um, I'm I'm in awe that people do that to buy my stuff, right? It's very humbling to realize that people are going to spend 50% more on their food dollar. Uh, do I think there's value in it? Absolutely. But I think the more and more people do this, we can reorient the system to where those prices can come back down to more reasonable because there'll be more people in the space, and then we can gain efficiencies in it. And there should be a farmers market in every small town.
Agreed. And it also continues to go back to just the educational part, because you've also mentioned buying in bulk, so like a quarter or half of a cow. Just thinking long term about it all,
Yeah,
because it might seem really pricey at the beginning, but if you do the cost actually versus if you go to the grocery store and Uber Eats and restaurants and all that, not only are you saving money in the long run, but from just the food itself, but your health itself too, because
yeah,
you're eating nutrient dense food that
that's
tastes
right.
delicious.
Yeah,
And that again changes your relationship with food
yeah,
and your health. And it just snowballs over time to where kind of how we used to be.
yeah.
And that's why I think Renaissance, the word works so well for it all.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent too of establishing um, what's been coined the counter economy. So again, going around all of the systems that are in place and doing things kind of in a different, unique way, right? So buying from local producers. I do most of my shopping on Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist. I use Crowd Health for my health,
Same.
my health insurance.
Yep.
Anything that I can do, even though it may, not ultimately be quite as efficient, just to encourage people to think outside the box and engage in this counter economy. This is going to come back to where I was with executing wars in foreign lands. The only reason that our government is able to go out there and kill people in other countries relentlessly is because we have fake money that they can just make whenever they want, right? I mean, otherwise, back in the day, 200 years ago, you know, kings would have to stop going to war against each other because they ran out of money. The U.S. can infinitely print more money and perpetually engage in wars, right? If we can keep a little bit of that money outside of their hands by engaging in trade amongst ourselves, I'm all for it, right? And I know it's nothing, right? They'll still print their money, but I think even with Bitcoin, all of that is coming to an end. So I just encourage people to get out there, meet your local producers, Start dealing cash with your dentist. Allow them to, stop using insurance companies who are robbing them as well. That we can do this. It just takes a little bit of effort and courage too. I know it's not easy.
No. I mean, especially when you've been so used to doing the same thing for so long.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about, say, you're in your 60s and 70s and you've always bought from the grocery store
Hmm.
your whole life. I mean, the longer you live and do something, the harder it is to change that habit.
Yeah. When I was a kid, up in outside of Pittsburgh, we had a grocery store. It was Al's Meat Market, and that's where we would shop, right? And the food was there. And then he went out of business because things like A&P and ultimately Walmart and all of these things came up, and they're driving these small shops out of business. There is a resurgence of these things. In Taylor, we have a gal. She's opened Haley's Grains, and she sells local produce, and she holds our
Hmm.
meat. She carries our meat, and she's it's kind of a boutique thing. I'd like to see that everywhere. I'd like to see again where local people in the community are opening up shops that they can sell their product at, right? And I'm guilty too. I shop on Amazon, but there's not any other options. So let's build the infrastructure so I don't have to shop on Amazon.
Yeah.
You know?
When I worked on the farm in Pennsylvania, nearby they had a self-serving stand essentially, and you walk in, just local produce, local honey,
Hmm.
local breads. Um, you had just raw milk, and then you just put the cash or check in and
Yeah.
leave what you want. And I've never experienced that
When
in
I
my whole
lived,
life. It
yeah,
took me 27 years. I was like, wow, this is incredible.
yeah. When I lived in outside of Galveston, there was a local dairy, and that was the same thing. They had just the refrigerators, and they had a can, and people would just put their money in their can, and you would grab a quart-sized mason jar of milk. It's like, wow, people still do this. This is great. And this is a great product.
Yeah, yeah,
And
that
before that, they were selling their milk to the commodity dairy market, right? And this way, he's able to make some money, keep his business afloat, and it's great for us too.
I'm curious. This is kind of transitioning a little bit because I forgot to mention this in the context of just the farmer suicides. I was talking to a friend. He grew up on a farm in Nebraska, and I think he would be either the fourth or fifth generation of that farm, but he's actually not taking it over because the land got so degraded from conventional model, but also chemical sprays that the whole surrounding area is just chock full of chemical sprays. And he's also mentioned just all of the health issues around that area. And I have not looked into it just yet because I just recently had this conversation, but it made me really think about that. I want to do research on the really heavy chemical usage, I guess, counties in America and see what the health is like in those areas because that
Yeah.
has to also play effect into your mental with as a farmer when all you're outside is insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, and pesticides, and those are just constantly in the air. That's gotta
Yeah.
completely mess with your health and also your mind.
I imagine it does. Yeah, we're really strip mining our country. I don't remember the numbers, but the amount of topsoil that goes into the Gulf of Mexico is phenomenal. If you've ever been to Galveston, the water's brown.
It's so Galveston's the worst beach, and
It
it's
is.
just it's
And,
so
and that's
yeah.
because all of the mud that comes out of the Mississippi River, which ultimately comes from, Missouri or in Montana, right? All of that comes downstream, goes out into the Gulf of Mexico, and then the Gulf Current brings it right back around to Galveston Island. But you think about how much topsoil that is that we're losing. It, I don't know how we fix that, right? I mean, regenerative farming is the answer to fixing that. But to do it on this, we've been abusing, since World War II.
Even before that, because even this is what so I love history and pretty much I'm a historian at heart, and so learning about agriculture and the history of it, we have had the answers for so long, but yet we continue to do everything that's against nature.
Hmm.
With the context of Nebraska, they used to have such amazing prairie lands,
Yeah.
and then as we expanded with America with all the different homestead acts, which inevitably caused the Dust Bowl, and now we're back to have even worse land than then,
Yeah.
and it's just destroyed that whole entire area with conventional farming and all the chemical sprays. It's just wild how We had not learned our lesson whatsoever.
Yeah, yeah. So at our ranch, we don't use any herbicide, pesticide, fungicide, and nor any petroleum-based fertilizers. So I bring in chicken manure, and we use that as a fertilizer. So every year I bring in 100 tons of chicken manure, and then I have on the property now. We had a big freeze a couple, I guess it was last February. Um, so they ended up chopping up all of those trees, and so I've got thousands and thousands of tons of wood chips out there, and so I'm going to incorporate that into my soil once they start to decay. But yeah, it's out there. It just takes a little bit of extra work, and it's doable. You can use fertilizers that aren't petroleum based that ultimately end up killing all of the microbes in the soil, which effectively makes you more dependent upon that same fertilizer, right? And so it's a negative feedback loop, and it's that's the condition that we're in.
Can you explain why you use chicken manure and why it's such a good fertilizer?
So yes, so when you harvest, ultimately you could be in a state of stasis, right? Equal. The cow eats the grass, the cow produces manure, the manure feeds the bacteria feed the grass grows again. But when you harvest an animal off of your property, you're taking off 1,000 pounds of effectively the nutrients that were once in your soil, right? And if you do that long enough, which is what we've been doing in this country, you end up with no nutrients left in your soil, and that's why our food has no flavor anymore. And so you can mimic that by putting out a petroleum-based fertilizer, right? Nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, um, and that's all derived from petroleum. But it doesn't have the same effect, right? The grass will grow, but the bacteria will die because there's a relationship between the bacteria and the plant itself. And now the plant doesn't need the bacteria, so it doesn't produce the sugars to feed the bacteria. Instead, it just consumes the raw nitrogen, and you have plenty of grass. So we've chosen. So when we harvest an animal, I have to replace those minerals and those nutrients, or else I'm going to be continually degrading my soil. So we've chosen to go with chicken manure, which is a byproduct, a waste product out of these large chicken houses, right? And we spread that out onto our pasture. Another reason that opted to do that, I mentioned at the beginning, we have very sandy soil where we're at. If I were to, and I've done this when we first started, use a petroleum-based fertilizer, we get these like 2-3 inch rain events all inside of an hour here in Central Texas, right? Where it just pours buckets. That fertilizer hits goes through the sand that I have, and about 18 inches down, there's a layer of clay. It hits that clay and it just runs down to the pond and then ultimately out into the Gulf of Mexico. I don't get any benefit from that fertilizer, even if I was to make the choice to use that. Whereas with chicken manure, it's an organic compound. It takes a lot longer to break down. It's got more mass to it. It doesn't dissolve immediately. So that gets more incorporated into my soil. Again, all of the organic matter helps with water retention. It's a long process, right? It takes multiple years to affect change. But over in the long haul, it's a much better product for us. So that's what we decided to do. Like I said, every year I bring in 100 tons of that stuff. Eventually, when I incorporate all of this decayed wood chips in, I'm hoping to see huge gains because I'm effectively going to change the nature of my soil and go from a loamy sand, hopefully, to a sandy loam.
Hmm.
So
Have you noticed improvements since you started 5 years ago?
I have, yeah, and so I haven't done like any scientific measurements of organic matter, but my carrying capacity on the land has increased. So we practice rotational grazing, which is also a net positive in that it gives the opportunity for the grass to actually recover, right? So if you just have open grazing, the cow is going to eat the tastiest grass. They're gonna grab the ice cream, right? And that'll continue to reduce the size of the roots underneath the soil because the plant isn't collecting enough solar energy to feed those roots and that whole cycle. And so by rotational grazing, it allows the plants to get up and grow without being bitten off, right? And so that coupled with all of the organic matter we're putting in, when we first bought the land, they had 15 cows on it. Now I've got something like 60 on that same amount of space. So, like I said, quantitatively, I don't know what that means,
Yeah.
but it's certainly moving in the right direction.
No, that's awesome. And then in terms of actually rotating, what is that process like with the 60 head?
Um, so so basically, when I built the infrastructure, I put in a lot of cross fencing, and I used a high tensile electric uh, line, and that enables me to use a product that's called polybraid. It's basically a conductive strands through a polyethylene string, and I'm able to cross fence small paddocks, and so I basically run three strands of this stuff across the pasture. I'll open one, the cows will come in, I'll close it, and then the next day, or however long, however depending upon the size of that paddock, I take the middle one out. The cows move to the new grass. I put the middle one back, and I go back to the very first one. I wind that up, and then I go put it in, upstream, if you will, to fresher grass, and I just continue that process around my pasture. Um, to do that, though, you have to have water in those locations, right? So we built the infrastructure. I pump water out of my lake, out of my pond. It's about a 2.5 acre pond, and I bought um, large water holding tanks. I have a 12,000 gallon tank in one hill and a 9,000 gallon tank on the other hill that allows me to use gravity to fill up the water trough. So every time I move the cows, I move the water trough with it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's actually I'm fairly certain that's exactly what we did on that farm too. Is and with moving the paddocks too, because as you were describing it, I vividly remember doing that exact
It's
same
very
thing.
labor intensive, right? Compared to just letting them free range. But when you look at the holding capacity per acre, it's worth it, in my opinion. Now you have to live on the property, right? You don't want to have to drive somewhere and do this every day, right? There's other ways to get better than just open grazing, and that would be to build permanent paddocks that you could, even if it's a week, right? And every week you go out there. But most of the people that raise cattle, they don't live on their land, so again, they got to deal with the situation that they have. Actually, most of the people, I would say that this is, I'm guessing, most of the people in Texas that raise cattle are really have the land to go hunting, right? And that cattle are just a tax incentive for them, not to have to pay the same valuation on the property.
Hmm.
They really just want a place to hunt, and then they have a couple head of cattle, so they can say they're a cattleman, and then they go to the auction and they sell these cattle every year. Again, they're a price taker. They're not really realizing how much money they're losing by doing that. So,
Interesting. I didn't
yeah.
realize that at all.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there are real cattle ranches, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But if you drive down most of the roads, and you'll see 100 acres, 50 acres, those people aren't really cattle ranchers, right? They just have a piece of property that they have cows on, and then once a year they'll scoop up the calves and take
Hmm.
them to the auction. Not that they leave them out there completely and ignore them. You can't do that. But they're not farming.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
No, that's secondary. No, that
Yeah.
makes sense. I'm curious. This is a pretty broad question, but in the years of doing this, what has been, I don't know, some of the favorite things about this new lifestyle that you have?
First off, I can't even remember back to another lifestyle. So I was I went to school at Texas A&M. I got out of college and went into the Army. Spent 7 years doing that. Went right into a large corporation, and which I'm still with. It's 25 years now. And then we only had a brief. We lived in New York for 3 years, and then we lived in Frisco for 3 years. And outside of that, I've been homesteading or farmsteading. Um, but I like the fact that I get to putz. I get to learn continually, right? I don't watch football. I don't binge Netflix, that type of stuff. I've usually always got a project that keeps me engaged. That I get to do what I like to do. Um, I've got, my wife calls me a serial hobbyist. I go through hobbies to where I get about 80% proficient in that, and I'll go move to a different hobby. So I've had several. I used to bake bread. I like grinding my own grain. I go to the nth degree, right? And so farming is kind of like the culmination. Uh, it's the capstone of being a serial hobbyist, right? Because now first off I get to engage in those hobbies and hopefully make money off of them. It helps, from a tax perspective, you get to write off a lot of your toys, if you will. And so, and then there's always something to do. There's always something to fix. And that can be very tedious oftentimes. But at the end of the day, it's like, yeah, but look what I got done. As opposed to, okay, I just, finished another series of Game of Thrones or what have you, right?
Yeah.
So, or watch somebody else play football on TV. I don't think people appreciate how much time they spend on football. You know, there's a lot of football happening Monday, Thursday, Friday, if you're into high school sports, Saturday, college sports, Sunday, and then you're back at Monday again.
Yep.
So, yeah, it's kind of crazy.
I mean, the farm I worked on didn't have Wi-Fi, didn't have any of that. So it was I mean, knew I'd be okay, but that still was way bigger adjustment than I initially had thought because we're so used to that now.
Yeah, yeah.
And it makes, especially as a guy, I mean, you just like doing the physical labor. There really is unlimited amount of things you could be doing because
Yeah.
if you're not working, then you can be strategizing about new projects that you might want to implement to test
Right.
out. That's why I love what I do right now, and I'm going to be doing it for quite some time. But long term, I want to ranch because that's all I think about.
This is I think this is a societal problem that is at the root of a lot of our societal problems, and that is that young men don't have a sense of accomplishment anymore.
That's why they turn to video games.
That's
'Cause
right. Yeah, they can conquer something. There's no dragons to go slay, right? And
Yeah.
so we have virtual dragons in the form of video games.
And it hits that exact same thing.
Sure, absolutely,
Yeah, and it's
absolutely.
why it's so addicting.
But there is opportunity to go out there and slay dragons. I mean, you can go out there and you can go fix a tractor or what have you. And at the end of the day, you have this huge sense of accomplishment about, hey, I fixed that. And then that gives you confidence, particularly as a young man, you get this confidence that, hey, I can change a tire. What else can I do, right? Oh, maybe I can, replace the starter on my truck. And that just builds from there, right? But we don't experience that anymore. We don't even change our own oil anymore.
Yeah,
How many kids actually are taught how to change a tire?
I was not.
Yeah.
So even I mean,
Yeah.
that's again why up until I switched to a farm, I didn't do many. I mean, I hiked, but I didn't do any of the hands-on
Yeah.
labor that you do on a farm.
Yeah.
And I realized how much I had missed out on.
And that's one of the reasons why again, going back to our beginning of our conversation, how I got into this, or I wanted my kids to be able to experience that, sure that you can get that in athletics, right? There's this team, camaraderie, you got an accomplishment, you were victors. And that's a good thing, right? But it's not for everybody. And it should be for everybody that you're able to have this sense of like, I can achieve, right? It was hard, but I did it, right? And we just don't experience that anymore.
No.
They get now, it's like, I did it, but it really wasn't all that hard. You're sitting there in a video game, right? If you get slashed with an axe, you don't really feel that. Whereas if you're out there turning wrenches and the wrench slips and your knuckles are busted, you felt that. It's very real.
Well, also too with that, you go from conception to actually seeing the physical product.
Yeah.
So even something just like building a shed, you go from planning all that out to actually building that out. And once you see that, in terms of accomplishment,
Yeah.
that's such a great feeling. And
Yeah, I was very fortunate. My father and all my brothers and sisters. My dad was born in 1922, so during the Great Depression or right before it. And so when I was a kid, he built his own house also, and I always admired that. But he was always building something, right? When I was in high school, he had a small machine shop in our garage, which I got to putz around with. I'm so grateful that I got to live that way, and I just wanted to give my kids a little bit of that. How much, they didn't appreciate it at the time, I'm sure, but I think they're better members of society as a result of that.
I like that. The last question I have, are you religious?
I am, yeah.
Because for me personally, the most surprising thing that come out of losing my brother was once I switched into agriculture, I really started thinking about that a lot. I mean, especially when I was on the farm and seeing the connection to the land with the animals. I mean, even starting below the ground, the whole entire process to where now it brought me back to definitely a big believer because at the time I was agnostic. So I'm curious, since moving to your homestead and just seeing just essentially the natural world, how has that, I guess, shaped your perspective on just the world and you being religious?
That is a fantastic question. I'm gonna have to mull over that one. So before when so I really okay. So this is a very long story and a whole separate podcast, but I'll try to. So 9/11 really opened my eyes to the reality that people believe in their religion enough. And again, this maybe I was drinking the Kool-Aid. They really believe in their religion enough to kill themselves over it, right? And kill other people as a result of it. And I was raised a Catholic, and I didn't really have a good relationship with my Creator at the time, and I'm not sure that Catholicism really promotes that so much, at least in my experience. Um, and so I really started thinking to myself, "Am I a Christian? Do I have core fundamental beliefs that would inspire me to rise up to that degree?" And the answer was no. Um, and so then I started doubting myself as to whether I was a Christian at all, and I wasn't. And so then I started, and so then we moved shortly thereafter, and then my wife, she made the first steps into a local community church, Calvary Chapel in Plano, Texas, and it's when I got there that I really was exposed to the Word of God, because again, I don't think Catholicism really, at least from in my instance, didn't really encourage a personal relationship with the God of the universe, right? And so from that point on, again, I'm a serial hobbyist, so kind of theology was one of my hobbies, and I started reading all of the classics and things like that, and and it really like opened my eyes to the reality of there is a God who wants to have a personal relationship with me, and that's really mind-boggling when you think about it. And so when we moved back here to Central Texas, I kind of and the kids graduated high school. That relationship maybe wasn't quite the same, but to your point, when I'm out there on the farm and you look around and you think of the majesty of it all, and when you look at and you think about the systems that make farming and make life possible and how complicated and how complex they are and all of that, it's really it's awe-inspiring and it's very humbling. And so I see that every day and I think about that, and it's like, wow, I get to be part of God's creation and carrying on his mandate to be a steward of that creation. So yeah, so for me, thanks for bringing it up. It helps put things back into perspective, and it's something that sometimes you lose sight of. Every once in a while, though, you get a glimpse of that, and all you can do is just praise God.
That's yeah, that's the realization I had whenever thinking, I mean, learning about just the soil food web and all of the biology that's going on
Yeah.
underground. And then you think about what happens whenever you till the soil that destroys all that biology. Nature responds, and then that's why conventional ag
Hmm.
with tillage destroys the soil. That's what happened with the Dust Bowl. But with that connection, when you have healthy soil, that promotes great grass, which the grass is then consumed by animals such as cows, and then we consume them, and it's just that whole cycle.
Hmm.
But just I don't know, the whole connection to it all, to me, is just there's no coincidence with that. And then when I learned about, say, with trees, for example, they know when there's a dying tree, so they'll try to send resources through the roots of the ground. And I
Yeah.
just kept thinking more and more of those, and then actually being in the land and seeing that yourself.
Yeah.
To me, there's just no denying that there is
Yeah,
a
I
God.
think there's a book. It's called the Great Watchmaker. I think it is, and it points back to, okay, so there's this very complicated watch. Somebody had to build that. Well, we've got a much more complicated existence. There's intelligent design behind it. I don't know. I think it takes more faith to be an atheist than it does to be a believer in a sovereign being. So,
I used to not believe that, but now I definitely do.
yeah.
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 Well, thank you for joining, John. I
Yeah.
really appreciate this
Yeah,
conversation.
I had a lot of fun.
Visit www.theregenaissance.co to learn more.